September 9, 1943. The Gulf of Salerno didn't roar with thunder from the sky. It came from the sea. Allied warships unleashed fire into the dawn, their echoes tumbling through the hills of southern Italy. Inside cracked stone houses, families huddled together, praying the next explosion wouldn't find them. For years, propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters, looters, killers, men who would take what little remained. So when the first GIs splashed ashore, rifles glinting under a smoky sky, fear gripped every heart. But what happened next wasn't written in any plan of war. It wasn't about gunfire or glory. It began with something small, the opening of a tin can, Spam. And in that moment, something impossible began to unfold. A bridge built not from treaties or flags, but from food. This is the forgotten story of how hungry Italian civilians and battle-worn American soldiers found humanity in the unlikeliest of places, over shared rations on a shattered shore. The dawn over the Gulf of Salerno bled red against the horizon, but it wasn't sunrise painting the sky. It was artillery fire. The thunder of naval guns rolled like storm clouds breaking the sea. Villagers pressed their backs against crumbling cellar walls, clutching rosaries as plaster rained from the ceilings. Mothers whispered prayers through trembling lips, hoping the next explosion would fall anywhere but here. For years, propaganda had warned them of this moment. Posters showed Americans as wolves in uniform, men who would pillage, defile, destroy. Now, their ships filled the bay, black silhouettes against the burning light. The ground shook as shells struck the beaches, windows shattered, dogs howled in the alleys. Somewhere above the smoke, a church bell clanged wildly, not from faith, but from fear. Children clung to their mothers, too scared to cry. In the distance, voices shouted in English, harsh, unfamiliar sounds carried by the wind, signaling that the strangers had arrived. In narrow streets, the old whispered of earlier wars. French, Austrians, Germans, all had come before, and each had taken something that could never be returned. Why would these invaders be any different? From the hills, families watched as boats filled with soldiers slammed against the shore. The sea frothed white, stained by smoke and flame. Tanks crawled forward, their tracks carving scars into the sand. One young boy, Antonio, peeked from behind a wall, eyes wide. He had never seen such machines. They looked like monsters rising from the waves, steel beasts with hearts of fire. Meanwhile, in the chaos of the landing, American soldiers fought to stay alive. Bullets hissed past their helmets, thudding into the wet sand. The air reeked of cordite and salt. Private Frank D'Angelo stumbled ashore, rifle clenched tight, boots sinking in the mud. The roar of aircraft screamed above him. Somewhere nearby, someone shouted for a medic, but his ears rang too loud to hear. When the shooting paused, the silence that followed was stranger than the battle itself. Smoke drifted inland like a slow tide. Birds were gone. Only the ocean kept moving, indifferent, eternal. Civilians dared to lift their shutters. Faces, pale and hollow-eyed, appeared in windows. They saw soldiers covered in grime, young and weary, not the monsters they'd been told of, just boys who looked barely grown. One soldier knelt beside a broken wall, pulling a crumpled photo from his pocket. A family in Brooklyn, smiling at a kitchen table. He tucked it back and stared toward the burning town. In those moments, fear blurred on both sides. Italians feared the conquerors they thought had come to take. The Americans feared the ghosts waiting behind every doorway, not knowing friend from foe. The first day of Salerno was not victory or liberation. It was confusion. Smoke, screams, and rumors carried faster than truth. No one yet realized they were standing on the edge of something human. As dusk fell, the thunder quieted, leaving only smoldering ruins and the distant hum of engines. Families crept from hiding, stepping through debris that once had been their homes. They saw the strangers, exhausted, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Some soldiers shared cigarettes, others sat alone, staring at nothing. Neither side spoke, but something unspoken began to shift. In that fragile silence between explosions and nightfall, the war paused, just long enough for fear to meet uncertainty and for the first flicker of humanity to survive the storm that had begun. When dawn rose again over Salerno, the smoke still hung thick over the rooftops. The battle had moved inland, but its echoes lingered in every shattered wall and scorched olive grove. Civilians began to creep out of cellars, blinking against the light. Dust clung to their hair and clothes, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. The world outside looked both familiar and ruined. The streets were littered with debris, broken tiles, splintered carts, and the twisted remains of shutters. The smell of burned wood mixed with the metallic sting of gunpowder and salt. Children, barefoot and silent, moved first. They picked through rubble for anything edible, a potato, a crust, a memory of normal life. Their mothers watched with tired eyes, too drained to stop them. Along the docks, the bodies of boats lay half sunk in shallow water. American soldiers trudged past, boots slapping against wet cobblestones, rifles slung low, helmets streaked with grime. Their faces looked older than their years. A small boy darted from behind a wall, staring at the soldiers with wary curiosity. His clothes hung in tatters. He had the hollow look of hunger, that unmistakable absence of childhood softness. Private Frank D'Angelo saw him first. Something about the boy's eyes, wide, dark, defiant, reminded him of home, of his kid brother running through Brooklyn streets before the war swallowed everything. D'Angelo lowered his rifle, then hesitated. Training told him not to engage. Orders said civilians might be dangerous. But hunger speaks louder than orders, and kindness often disobeys reason. He reached into his pack, fingers closing around a dented tin. Spam. The smell, salty and heavy, filled the air as he peeled back the lid with his ration key. The boy flinched, unsure. His sister, smaller and barefoot, gripped his arm, whispering in a dialect that sounded almost like the language D'Angelo had grown up hearing in his parents' kitchen. He smiled awkwardly, crouched low, and offered the tin. For a moment, the child didn't move. Then, with trembling fingers, he took it, as if accepting something sacred rather than food. When he bit into the meat, his eyes widened. It was soft, greasy, rich, a taste long forgotten. His sister leaned close, took a bite, and gasped softly, disbelief melting into relief. Word spread quickly through the narrow alleys. Italians who had hidden in fear now peeked from doorways, watching Americans give away what they had carried across an ocean. An old man emerged, clutching a wooden cross. A soldier handed him a biscuit from his pack. The man crossed himself, tears welling, whispering that it was the first wheat he'd tasted in months. The courtyard filled with murmurs, gratitude mixed with confusion. These were not looters or conquerors, at least not today. They were weary young men, sharing what little comfort they despised, but others treasured. The soldiers laughed, half in embarrassment, as children swarmed them for candy and crackers. For the first time since the invasion, the sound of laughter rose above the echo of distant guns. D'Angelo watched the children eat and thought of his mother's table, of pasta steaming in the kitchen, of Sundays before the world went mad. In that courtyard, for a heartbeat, war seemed far away. Night fell quietly over Salerno. The smell of smoke still lingered, but so did something new. The faint scent of fried spam rising from shattered homes, mingling with the whisper of hope. By the third day, the sound of battle had faded into a distant rhythm. Salerno no longer shook from artillery. Instead, it pulsed quietly with the fragile rhythm of survival. The townspeople began to move more freely through the ruins, gathering wood, fetching water, searching for relatives who hadn't answered since the first bombardment. Each step felt both defiant and uncertain. The Americans were everywhere now, patrolling streets, repairing radios, hauling supplies ashore. Their presence filled the air with the smell of fuel, sweat, and the strange metallic tang of canned food. To the Italians, these soldiers were both terrifying and fascinating. They smiled too easily, laughed too loudly, and carried pockets filled with things that shimmered like treasure: chocolate, gum, and cigarettes. For years, the word American had meant fear, gangsters and monsters, men who would take rather than give. Yet here they were, offering biscuits to children who had forgotten what sugar tasted like. The first bite of chocolate was almost holy. A boy closed his eyes as the sweetness melted on his tongue. Around him, others stared, as though watching a miracle unfold. Soldiers passed tins of corned beef and hardtack through broken windows, laughing at their own absurdity. To them, these were rations. To the Italians, they were feasts. One woman clutched a single biscuit against her chest, whispering that she would save it for her daughter. Another crossed herself before drinking coffee poured by a soldier with trembling hands. The irony hung heavy in the air. The food soldiers cursed. Spam, powdered eggs, chalky chocolate became symbols of life for those who had known only hunger. Lucia, a widow from the harbor district, watched from her doorway as soldiers handed food to children. Her stomach ached, but pride held her still. Begging, even in hunger, felt unbearable. Private D'Angelo noticed her hesitation. He approached slowly, offering a tin of corned beef hash, his expression unsure, almost shy. He didn't speak her language, but hunger doesn't need translation. Lucia hesitated, shame and need battling behind her eyes. Then she reached out, fingers trembling as she accepted the tin. The soldier smiled, awkward and kind, then turned away without a word. That night, Lucia warmed the food over the coals. The smell filled her small kitchen, and her children's faces glowed in the flickering light. For once, they ate until full. She herself barely touched the food, content to watch them. The taste, the warmth, the sound of their laughter, it was a kind of hope she'd forgotten existed. The next morning, she whispered to a neighbor that perhaps the Americans were not demons after all. The neighbor laughed softly, but didn't argue. Suspicion was still heavy, but doubt had cracked. By the week's end, children waited at street corners when soldiers passed. They called out, "Cioccolato! Biscotti!" and waved shyly. The soldiers waved back, tossing candy and smiles in return. The exchange was simple, almost trivial. But beneath it pulsed something larger, the first taste of trust. Not spoken, not promised, just felt, shared in crumbs and kindness. And in a world still trembling from war, that trust, fragile, uncertain, born from hunger and humanity, became more nourishing than any ration ever could. The morning sun washed through broken shutters, spilling pale light across Lucia's small kitchen. The tin of corned beef sat empty beside the stove, its scent still clinging to the air like memory. Her children slept curled together beneath a blanket patched too many times to count. Their faces were peaceful for once, free from the gnawing tension that hunger had carved into their features. Lucia watched them and wondered how long this quiet would last. The war had taught her that peace was never a promise, only a pause between storms. Outside, the streets carried the sounds of unfamiliar footsteps and foreign laughter. American voices filled the air, deep and strange, laced with accents she couldn't place but no longer feared. The neighbors whispered that some women were taking food from soldiers in exchange for favors. Others swore that kindness alone explained it. Lucia kept her head down, choosing silence over judgment. She remembered the soldier's eyes, soft, uncertain, and the way he'd held out the ration tin as though he were offering his own heart. That look had unsettled her more than hunger ever did. Later that day, she ventured toward the square. Children were gathered there, playing between the shell craters. Soldiers watched from nearby, handing out gum and hardtack like offerings to tiny kings. Private D'Angelo was among them, crouched near a fountain that no longer flowed. His rifle leaned against a wall, forgotten for a moment. He was laughing, a sound too human for war. Lucia hesitated at the edge of the square, unsure if she should approach. Her pride warned her to turn back, but her children tugged at her skirt, eyes wide with hope. She walked forward, each step measured, her heart hammering. When D'Angelo saw her, recognition flickered. He rose, brushing dust from his uniform, his smile small but genuine. He reached into his pack and drew out another tin. Spam this time. The metal glinted in the sun as if it were gold. Lucia froze, uncertain whether to accept. For a long moment, they simply stood there. Two strangers, separated by language, joined by hunger. Then she extended her hand and took it, her voice barely above a whisper. Grazie. D'Angelo nodded, his accent mangling the reply. Prego. It made her laugh despite herself, a small sound she hadn't made in months. The tension between them softened into something almost warm. Back home, she opened the tin and spooned small portions for her children. The smell filled the room again, thick and salty, carrying with it a strange comfort she didn't want to question. That night, she saved a piece for D'Angelo, placing it carefully on a small plate. It wasn't much, just a gesture, a mirror of the kindness that had reached her first. When he passed by the next morning, she stepped outside and offered it. He hesitated, then took the food and smiled, surprised. In that smile, something wordless and human passed between them. Neighbors watched from their windows, whispering as always. But Lucia no longer cared. She had made her choice, not one of loyalty or betrayal, but of faith in a kind of decency that war had almost erased. As night fell, she listened to her children breathing in their sleep and realized that for the first time in years the sound didn't hurt. Hope, fragile and quiet, had returned to her table. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. The guns had not fallen silent entirely, but their distant rumble had become a kind of background heartbeat to the living. In Salerno's narrow streets, children played between piles of debris, their laughter bouncing off walls still blackened by fire. Life, stubborn and irrepressible, was returning in crooked, uncertain steps. American soldiers began to wander beyond their checkpoints, drawn by curiosity and boredom as much as by duty. They carried their rifles loosely now, more as burdens than as threats. The Italians had grown used to their presence. These tall boys with their strange accents and endless supplies of canned food. Fear had shifted into fascination, suspicion into cautious warmth. One afternoon, a soldier tried to teach a group of children how to blow bubbles with chewing gum. They failed spectacularly, popping sticky pink explosions across their faces until everyone was howling with laughter. Lucia watched from her doorway, her hands on her hips, torn between disapproval and amusement. Her daughter, Anna, tried the gum and shrieked with delight as it stretched farther than her imagination had ever gone. Nearby, a soldier strummed a battered guitar he'd salvaged from a bombed-out shop. The melody was foreign, clumsy, yet it filled the air with something that almost sounded like peace. An old man joined in, humming a folk tune older than memory. The blend of American chords and Italian rhythm tangled into a sound neither side fully understood, but both felt. Private D'Angelo sat on a step, polishing his boots half-heartedly, watching Lucia's children chase one another through the dust. He caught her eye and smiled. She didn't look away this time. The laughter in the streets was uneasy at first, like a muscle long unused. But with each passing day, it grew stronger, echoing through courtyards that once echoed only with fear. Even the soldiers seemed lighter. They joked with one another, traded words in broken Italian, swapped rations for smiles. The war, for fleeting hours, felt distant, like thunder over another horizon. Children began naming the soldiers. Franco, they called D'Angelo, though his name was Frank. Joe, Tommy, Billy, names that rolled strangely, but stuck like the sweetness of candy. Lucia's son followed D'Angelo constantly, mimicking his salute, his walk, even the way he leaned on his rifle. The soldier laughed, pretending to march the boy through imaginary drills. One evening, a group of GIs cooked near the square. The smell of frying Spam mingled with garlic from nearby homes. Someone joked that Italy had improved army food overnight. Lucia brought a small loaf of bread she'd baked over embers, offering it shyly. The soldiers clapped and cheered, breaking pieces to dip into the sizzling meat. For a moment, everyone belonged. Under a cracked balcony, music and laughter mingled with the smell of coffee and smoke. Even the ruins seemed softer beneath that light, less haunted, more human. War still loomed beyond the hills, but inside Salerno, something new had taken root. It wasn't victory or peace. It was the fragile, defiant joy of remembering how to live. And as the night deepened, filled with voices and music, Lucia realized that laughter, humble, imperfect laughter, was the first sound of freedom she'd heard in years. The fragile peace of Salerno began to hum with curiosity. With the shelling gone and the fear dimming, Italians and Americans found themselves studying one another, like two worlds blinking into the same light. The soldiers wandered through alleys lined with half-collapsed homes, their boots crunching over broken tiles. Children followed, calling out English words they'd learned. Okay, chocolate, good. Each syllable shouted like a victory. Cultural confusion was everywhere. What the soldiers considered ordinary seemed wondrous to the locals. Chewing gum, for instance, baffled nearly everyone. To Italians, it looked like food that never disappeared. One afternoon, Private D'Angelo handed gum to a group of children. They chewed cautiously, puzzled, then burst into hysterics as the sticky treat stretched and snapped between their teeth. Their laughter drew half the street. An old woman crossed herself, muttering that these foreigners ate rubber. The soldiers laughed so hard they couldn't explain. For the first time, laughter felt safer than words. Coffee was the next revelation. Americans brewed theirs thin and bitter, scooping powder from cans into dented tin cups. To Italians, it looked like dirty water pretending to be espresso. When D'Angelo offered Lucia's neighbor a sip, the man nearly spat it out, horrified. "Questo non è caffè," he exclaimed, waving his hands. The soldier blinked, confused, then laughed helplessly. Later that day, the same man invited D'Angelo into his kitchen. There, over a battered stove, he brewed real coffee, dark, thick, and strong enough to make the soldier's eyes water. Lucia watched from the doorway as D'Angelo tried to drink it without grimacing. He failed miserably. The old man roared with laughter, clapping him on the back until tears rolled down both their faces. Every misunderstanding turned into a story. A soldier offered canned peaches, which a mother refused, thinking they were pickled eggs. Another tried to trade tobacco, not realizing his gift was for chewing, not smoking. Lucia's children mimicked English words with theatrical flair. "Spamissimo!" they shouted, turning the soldiers' food into jokes. The GIs, delighted, repeated Italian phrases so mangled that even the grandmothers couldn't keep straight faces. One evening, a group of soldiers joined villagers for dinner. Someone produced an accordion, and soon the cramped kitchen filled with clapping, off-key singing, and the rattle of tin cups against tables. In a corner, Lucia stirred pasta with slices of Spam, her signature twist. When she served it, the Americans cheered, claiming she'd done the impossible, made army food taste like heaven. It became a ritual. Every night after duty, soldiers drifted toward the square, drawn by the smell of cooking, the promise of laughter, and the comforting rhythm of an unfamiliar language. Even small gestures mattered. A handshake, a shared cigarette, a song hummed in the dark. These were the threads weaving two broken worlds together. Misunderstandings never vanished completely. But they softened, transforming from barriers into bridges. Each mistake became another reason to laugh, another reminder that kindness didn't always need translation. And as the laughter spilled through Salerno's narrow streets, war felt, for a fleeting heartbeat, like something that existed far beyond the reach of coffee cups and children's laughter. Days stretched into weeks, and the rhythm of Salerno shifted again. What began as caution grew into a hesitant routine, a fragile coexistence between those who had invaded and those who had endured. The Americans no longer walked with rifles ready. They carried them loosely, like accessories to a job that no longer required constant fear. The Italians, in turn, stopped hiding when they passed. Each morning, children gathered near the square, waiting for their familiar soldiers to appear. The war still rumbled beyond the hills, but inside the town the sound felt muted, distant, unreal. Lucia's children were among the first to greet them. Anna clutched her doll, repaired with scraps of cloth a GI had given her, while her brother strutted proudly with a soldier's belt around his waist. Private D'Angelo had become a fixture in their small world. He no longer seemed foreign. His laughter belonged to the same air. His words, though broken, carried warmth that needed no translation. Lucia watched him from her doorway each day, her wariness now tempered by gratitude. His presence reminded her that kindness, even in chaos, could survive without needing to explain itself. In the marketplace, women began trading again. Soldiers offered cigarettes, soap, or canned meat, while locals returned with bread, wine, and stories. The exchanges were clumsy but honest, the beginnings of trust. One afternoon, D'Angelo helped repair a broken well near Lucia's home. As he worked, men from the neighborhood watched in silence, then joined in, handing him tools as though testing his intentions. By sunset, the water flowed again. Cheers erupted. Someone brought wine. Someone else started singing. The soldier blushed as they toasted him, his name mispronounced but his smile utterly clear. The fear that once haunted every corner had begun to loosen its grip. Suspicion still lingered, but it no longer ruled. Laughter and gratitude were slowly taking its place. At night, soldiers gathered by small fires. They spoke quietly of home, of Brooklyn, Chicago, Kansas, describing lives that seemed like fables to those listening. The Italians shared stories, too, of hunger and survival. Language often failed, but gestures filled the gaps. A touch on the shoulder, a shared drink, a tear wiped away. Communication through empathy rather than words. Lucia began bringing food to the soldiers' post, simple meals of bread and beans. She said it was to thank them for water, but D'Angelo sensed something deeper in her eyes. He gave her chocolate in return, saving pieces from his rations. Her children worshipped him for it, their laughter bubbling with innocence the war had almost erased. Rumors of German counterattacks spread occasionally, whispering through the town like cold wind. Each time the people tensed, afraid that kindness would vanish with the next gunfire. But it never did. Every time the soldiers returned from patrol, the town greeted them with relief, as though confirming that the fragile peace still held. By late autumn, familiarity had replaced fear completely. The Americans were no longer strangers. They had become part of the town's heartbeat, symbols not of war, but of an unexpected, enduring humanity. By winter's edge, Salerno had found its rhythm again. The sounds of hammers, laughter, and distant church bells replaced artillery. What remained of life rebuilt itself around something simple: food, shared and savored. Meals became the new dialogue. Soldiers traded tins of rations for homemade bread, olives, and wine. Words failed often, but smiles carried meaning that no dictionary could capture or define. Every morning, the scent of wood smoke mingled with the metallic tang of Spam sizzling in pans. It was absurd and beautiful. American army meat transformed into Italian comfort by garlic and patience. Lucia had become known for it. Her spam pasta, as the soldiers called it, was legend among the GIs. They lined up for a taste, laughing that she could turn rations into miracles. She would shake her head and smile, pretending not to understand their teasing. But inside, she felt pride, not for the food, but for the dignity it restored to her broken kitchen. Children carried pieces of hardtack like treasure, dunking them in coffee or trading them for candy. They mimicked English words as if flavor itself could be spoken. Good, sweet, thank you. D'Angelo often sat with Lucia's family, sharing what he could spare. He'd hand her children chocolate and listen as Lucia hummed old songs. The air between them felt lighter than war should allow. One afternoon, he brought her powdered eggs. She stared at the packet, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. He gestured how to mix them, his pantomime so earnest she couldn't help but laugh. When she finally cooked them, the smell filled her home with something faintly familiar, like the memory of abundance. Her children devoured every bite, their joy almost painful to watch. That night, Lucia repaid the gesture with a dish of roasted chestnuts, saved from a neighbor's tree. She pressed them into his hands, saying only, "For family." The word crossed both languages easily. The soldiers began inviting locals to their makeshift mess tents. Meals were loud, chaotic, full of clashing accents and clinking tin cups. The food was bland, but the laughter seasoned everything perfectly. Evenings blurred into small feasts. Someone always played music, a harmonica here, a mandolin there. Songs tangled in the smoky air, their meanings secondary to the warmth they carried. Food became confession. Over soup and spam, soldiers spoke of homes far away. Italians shared stories of lost sons, of empty winters and stubborn hope. Each spoonful felt like an act of healing. Sometimes Lucia would pause mid-meal, staring at D'Angelo across the table. The candlelight caught his tired eyes, and she'd think how strange it was, this bond born of hunger and compassion. He noticed her gaze once, smiled shyly, and said, "Mama would like your cooking." The sentence was clumsy but heartfelt. She blushed, the first color her face had seen in years. The neighbors teased her gently, whispering that love was growing faster than the wheat that never came. Lucia only laughed, waving them off, though a secret warmth stayed beneath her ribs. In Salerno, every shared meal became a promise that even in war's shadow, kindness could still rise, hot, fragrant, and human, like bread baking after a long famine. And so, in kitchens scarred by shell fire, the language of food replaced the language of fear. It spoke softly, but its meaning endured long after the guns fell silent. Winter crept quietly into Salerno, wrapping the ruined town in cold that bit through every wall. Smoke curled from chimneys patched with tin, and the sea wind carried both salt and sorrow. The laughter that once filled the streets had softened. The war had not ended, only moved north, but the town clung to its fragile calm like a candle trembling in the wind. Each morning, soldiers marched past in smaller numbers. New faces replaced old ones, and every departure felt heavier, as if the town were slowly exhaling the breath it had been holding. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said the Germans were regrouping beyond the mountains. Others whispered that the Allies might pull back, leaving Salerno defenseless. Fear, once dormant, began to stir again. Lucia felt it in her bones. She stocked what little food she had, counted tins and crusts, and watched her children more closely, sensing the storm that always seemed to return. D'Angelo noticed her unease. He tried to reassure her with smiles and extra rations, slipping chocolate to the children as though sweetness alone could silence the rumors. It almost worked. At night, the soldiers still gathered near the square. They sang softly, their voices low against the crackle of the fires. The songs were slower now, heavy with homesickness and uncertainty. One evening, the sky flickered with distant flashes. Thunder, they hoped. but everyone knew that sound too well. Artillery, far off, but close enough to resurrect every buried fear. The next morning, the streets emptied again. Civilians stayed indoors. Soldiers moved briskly, rifles slung tight, their faces taut. The peace, it seemed, had been only borrowed time. Lucia found D'Angelo near the well, checking his gear. "You go north?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, avoiding her eyes, as if looking might make it harder to leave. Her children clung to his legs, unaware of what departure meant. He bent down, pressing the last of his candy into their small hands. "For when I come back," he said softly. He didn't know if he would. Neither did she. The silence between them carried everything words couldn't. Gratitude, fear, the ache of something unfinished. That evening the town waited for the worst. Yet no attack came, only wind and the creak of shutters swinging loose. The danger had paused, uncertain, like the rest of them. Lucia prayed quietly that the world would stay still for one more night. The children slept, their fingers sticky with chocolate, their dreams untouched by the whispers of approaching war. The next morning brought sunlight, cold but bright. D'Angelo's unit remained in town, orders delayed. The relief felt like stolen joy, a breath caught between grief and laughter. That day, soldiers and civilians shared one last meal together: bread, soup, and silence. Every smile carried the weight of knowing that peace, this fragile borrowed peace, could vanish in a single gunshot. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Lucia stood in her doorway, watching D'Angelo wave from the street. His figure faded into the haze, leaving behind the echo of something gentle, fleeting, and real. That night, she whispered to herself that peace, no matter how temporary, was still worth believing in, because for a time it had been enough to make them human again. Spring crept into Salerno like a secret, soft and slow. The hills beyond the ruins turned green again, and the sea, once filled with warships, shimmered quietly beneath forgiving light. The guns had moved north, but their echoes lingered. Craters became gardens, foxholes turned to wells, and the scent of new grass mingled with the faint, unshakable smell of smoke. The people of Salerno carried on. They rebuilt walls with bare hands, patched roofs with scraps, and planted seeds in soil still scarred by shrapnel. Hope took root between ruins. Lucia's children ran through the square barefoot, chasing each other with laughter that finally sounded unafraid. The war had taken much, but it hadn't silenced them. That mattered most. American soldiers still passed through, fewer now, faces unfamiliar, but uniforms the same. They brought supplies, shared smiles, and vanished again toward the north, toward battles still waiting. Lucia never saw D'Angelo return, though she thought of him often. Sometimes she'd find herself setting aside an extra piece of bread, out of habit more than hope. The courtyard where he'd first offered Spam had changed. Wildflowers sprouted through cracks in the stone. Children played there, unbothered by the ghosts that memory left behind. The war was ending, or so people said. No one dared celebrate too loudly. They'd learned that joy, like peace, was fragile, something to be held carefully, never assumed. In the evenings, music returned. Someone played a harmonica. Others clapped along. Songs of home and heartbreak mixed with laughter, and for the first time, they felt like a single people. Lucia sometimes joined in, humming softly as she stirred soup made from lentils and leftover tins. The sound of her voice, once muted by grief, rose clear and strong again. She remembered the night D'Angelo shared his last ration, his hands trembling slightly as he smiled. That small act, simple, human, had changed everything she thought she knew about war. In the months that followed, kindness became a kind of resistance. Soldiers helped repair bridges. Villagers baked bread for those who fought. Compassion spread quietly, faster than fear ever had. Children grew up telling stories of that winter, of chocolate bars like gold, of soldiers who spoke strange words but carried gentle eyes, of laughter echoing through shattered walls. For Lucia, those memories became her strength. When hunger returned, she remembered sharing. When fear crept close, she remembered laughter. Humanity, she realized, could survive anything if fed enough hope. Years later, the war was just a story. The town healed. The children grew. But the bond born of food and faith lingered in every meal, every shared gesture of kindness. When Lucia's daughter married, she served pasta with slices of Spam, not as a joke, but as tribute. Guests laughed, then cried, understanding what it meant without needing it explained. Time moved on, yet the seed planted in those hungry days kept growing, unseen, unshakable. Proof that even in the darkest soil, mercy could take root and bloom. And when the wind swept through Salerno, carrying the scent of sea and smoke, it also carried something softer, the memory of a soldier's gift and the enduring taste of humanity.